This is Jack Daniel's Honey with Dr. Pepper. And I'm Boozy ASMR. And today I'm going to be doing some leftist reading for you. This is a short piece about poverty and the Clintons and the Democratic Party. So, with that said, let's get started. So, this one's called Ending Poverty as We Know It by Frances Fox Piven and Fred Block. And it's part of the False Choices, the Faux Feminism of Hillary Rodham Clinton. Written by several different authors. Like I said, this one is from Piven and Block. In 2014, the U.S. Census reported that 45.3 million people, or 14.5% of the population, lived on incomes that made them officially poor. International comparisons suggest an even higher U.S. poverty rate, 17.9% in 2012. And that makes the U.S. the leader in poverty among the rich countries of the world. Most troubling of all are indications that extreme poverty, defined as the number of households living with incomes less than half of the federal poverty line, has been increasing rapidly over the last 15 years. And such extreme poverty households include close to 3 million children. Yet these levels of poverty receive almost no attention in our national political debates. Conservatives continue to insist that programs such as food stamps and unemployment insurance are abused by welfare cheaters. The left defends these programs, but timidly, preferring proposals to alleviate poverty by raising the minimum wage and creating more jobs. But we can use Hillary Clinton's history with the issue of poverty as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to address poverty by focusing on labor market reforms. Clinton began her career as a lawyer in the 1970s, the late 1970s, working with Marian Wright Edelman's poverty advocacy organization, the Children's Defense Fund. By the time she popularized the slogan, "It takes a village to raise a child," in her 1996 book of that title, this sort of liberalism was politically unfashionable, and Clinton was already a central player in a very different sort of politics. In the 1980s and 90s, the Republican war on blacks, the poor, and the already stingy American welfare state escalated, tapping into long-standing white racist and anti-government resentments. In response, the Democratic Leadership Council, DLC, a centrist group that sought to rebrand the Democratic Party, whittled away what little resolve Democrats had to defend welfare state programs, allowing the dominant political discourse to become increasingly hostile to the poor. In 1992, Bill Clinton actively allied with the DLC, campaigned for the presidency with the promise to end welfare as we know it, proposing a policy of 2 years and off to work. One of Clinton's first initiatives was to make work more rewarding by expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, a federal program dating back to 1975 that supplemented the earnings of low-wage workers. These initiatives pulled many low-income households above the poverty line. However, after the Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives in the 1994 midterm election, the Clintons' approach to the issue changed. The newly elected House, under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, produced a series of bills to eliminate aid to families with dependent children, the AFDC, which had been the main cash assistance program to the poor, its benefits going mostly to women and children. In the days of the War on Poverty, expanding access to the AFDC rolls was one of the main ways to direct resources into low-income communities. Federal courts recognized the right of eligible households to AFDC assistance, and activists used court rulings to force local officials to provide benefits that had been denied. The Republican plan was to eliminate this form of federal redress by abolishing AFDC and turning the new program over to the states, giving them wide latitude to deny benefits. It was central to the effort to deny potential recipients the ability to sue in federal courts. Twice, the Republicans sent legislation along these lines to President Clinton, who vetoed the legislation as too harsh. Within the White House, there was plenty of disagreement. Hillary Clinton advocated passing the punitive legislation and ending welfare, even as others in the administration, like Labor Secretary Robert Wright and Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, objected. In August of 1996, as President Clinton's re-election campaign loomed, he took Hillary's advice and signed the third bill. This version was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, and it created Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, to replace AFDC. Republicans and many Democrats argued for the new program by claiming the government checks to the poor created a condition called dependency that sapped recipients of the drive and self-reliance required for economic success. Hardly anyone probed deeply enough to recognize that dependency is part of the human condition. But the plan was that newly trained welfare workers would combat dependency by tough love. They would persuade and, when necessary, coerce welfare recipients to go out and take jobs, and with states setting strict time limits on a family's welfare eligibility, those who resisted would ultimately be cut off the rolls. Immediately after its passage, the new legislation was considered a success. The welfare rolls fell rather quickly, so too did poverty rates caused by a booming economy with strong employment growth in the late 90s. Furthermore, an increase in the minimum wage that was also passed in August of 1996, together with the earlier expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, made jobs at the bottom of the labor market more rewarding. Many former welfare recipients were able to enter the job market, and some of them were even able to live above the poverty line. But these favorable conditions did not last. In 2001, the economy slid into recession, and the 15 years since, the labor market has never been as tight as it was in 1999. Every indicator shows that wages at the bottom of the economy have remained stagnant. The credits that families with children get from the Earned Income Tax Credit have not been adjusted upwards since 1993, and the federal minimum wage was only modestly increased in 2009. So millions of people who previously might have relied on AFDC are either unable to find employment or have jobs that pay so little that both rates of poverty and extreme poverty have been climbing. While the Clinton effort to make work pay had a short shelf life, the TANF legislation endured, and it has worked just as its Republican architects intended. Welfare caseloads have plummeted from about 14 million in 1995 to 4.2 million today. Before welfare reform, 68% of families with children in poverty received cash assistance. By 2013, it had fallen to 36%, and the assistance these families received was only a fraction of the poverty line. States receive a TANF block grant from the federal government if they are allowed to use that money for other purposes. So they have a strong incentive to deny aid to eligible families by requiring recipients to look for work first or by simply cutting them from the rolls for rule infractions. And without recourse to the courts, there is nothing that the poor or their advocates can do. It is no surprise, then, that when millions of people forced into the labor market, wages and working conditions at the bottom have deteriorated. The obstacles to aid are so extreme that during the Great Recession of 2007, when unemployment exceeded 10%, the worst downturn since the 30s, 16 states saw continued declines in their TANF rolls between 2007 and 2011, even though the number of unemployed had risen nationally by 71%. Since as few as 40% of the unemployed are eligible for unemployment insurance in any given month, this meant millions of families were eligible only for food stamps in the midst of a global economic crisis that resulted from the speculative excesses of Wall Street. Because of TANF, the U.S. had effectively regressed to the early 1930s, when many of the unemployed had no recourse other than private charity. In a word, the Clintons gambled in 1996 that eliminating a legally protected right to assistance for the poor would not in total matter because of their policies to improve the compensation of low-wage work, such as the higher minimum wage and a larger earned income tax credit. But while the gamble worked in the short term, it ultimately failed because of broad changes in the American labor market. Had the Clintons been more familiar with the history of welfare policies in England and the U.S., they might not have made the same mistake. In 19th century England, the principle of less eligibility was clearly articulated, and it meant that no prime-age adult receiving assistance should be as well off as even the lowest paid worker. That principle has in fact shaped programs to assist the poor for centuries, and it helps account for their harshness. It is easy to understand why the employers of low-wage labor insist on less eligibility. Without it, they would have been unable to force people to work in the dark, satanic mills of early industrialization. The degradation of the poor that results both from their meager subsistence and from the ritualized insult that is a condition of receiving that subsistence has also made them into social pariahs, a despised class, ensuring that most of the time a broader public can be encouraged to turn against them. The principle of less eligibility has always been cruel to the people who are its victims, and divisive as well, since the application of the principle turns those who are barely better off against those who are deemed poor. Indeed, it turns the poor against themselves as they struggle to salvage a bit of dignity in the midst of campaigns of ritualized insult. For example, after the passage of TANF in the late 1990s, welfare recipients in New York City were made to wear bright orange vests as they cleaned the parks. But now the cruelty looms even larger, because wage work has become ever more precarious and relegates so many to poverty. If we continue to be obsessed with worries about dependency, we will not be able to solve the problem of poverty as it unfolds in the economy. Much of the left in the U.S. holds on to its faith in full employment as the panacea that will heal American social problems, including poverty. As one example, Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign focuses on creating full employment, which has been the left's main anti-poverty program for almost a century. On this platform, not only will there be quote, jobs for all, but tight labor markets will lead to wage increases, stronger unions, and all the social goods that will follow from more powerful unions, including regulation of business and enlarged commons and better protections for those who cannot participate in the full employment economy. Some proponents even claim that through the simple expedient of passing legislation to make the federal government the employer of last resort, permanent full employment will be realized. Yet the full employment approach to poverty has consistently failed, with terrible consequences for many millions of people left behind. The cautionary tale of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act suggests how risky this approach is. We certainly recognize that really tight labor markets can do amazing things, as during World War II, when long impoverished people, including Southern black men and women, became skilled shipyard workers, earned decent wages, but the real lesson of history is that labor markets have rarely ever been that tight. The reason is obvious. Employers, both large and small, have always mobilized ferociously against a policy of full employment. As they mobilized to defeat the 1945 Full Employment Bill, and did so at the height of organized labor's political power. They have many other tricks in their repertoire, including recruiting workers from beyond the borders of the U.S. Barring a political upheaval that few of us can imagine, the idea that such employer opposition can be overcome for extended periods of time is little more than a fantasy. This issue of employer resistance is critical because it is only when labor markets are very tight, as they were briefly in the late 1990s, that one sees real improvements through the labor market for those in poverty. Even today, with unemployment down to around 5%, wage levels at the bottom of the labor market are still stagnant, and many people have simply given up looking for work. In fact, the labor force participation rate for adults is at its lowest level since the 1970s, and little progress is being made to reduce the number of people who are poor. And yet already mainstream economists are worrying that any further tightening of the labor market would be likely to produce dangerously high rates of inflation. Trying to achieve full employment is a flawed political and economic strategy for the following compelling reasons. Over the last 30 years, the U.S. has seen a dramatic drop in the manufacturing labor force as a consequence of technological progress and the movement of production overseas. While some manufacturing jobs are coming back, the average new factory employs just a small fraction of the numbers that staffed auto plants a generation ago. Even if one reads skeptically the claims that millions of white-collar and service jobs are about to be destroyed by sophisticated robots and thinking machines, it is still likely that existing jobs will disappear faster than new jobs can be created. 2. Economic stagnation and climate change in the global south have already created an enormous wave of refugees and migrants seeking safety and opportunity in North America, Europe, and Australia. And there is every reason to believe that this global migration will grow much larger. While Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and his nativist supporters dream of a wall to keep these people out, simple decency requires that the U.S. and other wealthy countries increase the number that are taken in. But an increase in the number of immigrants with or without documents will mean even more people fighting for jobs that will continue to be scarce. Even if it were achieved, full employment does not actually solve the complicated test of juggling work and family obligations that are so pressing for people today. Often what people need is not more employment, but paid leave to care for children or dying parents or medical crises. And many people want and need part-time jobs that are well compensated and have good benefits because they are combining work and schooling with child rearing. Those who are in low-wage service sector jobs often complain more than anything about the unpredictability of their work schedules. Some of them would gladly work fewer hours in exchange for greater control over their work schedule. Full employment, especially full employment at decent wages, has always been yoked to the imperative of economic growth. But it is now obvious that our historic patterns of resource-intensive economic growth are a threat to the future of the planet. Given the urgent need to respond to global climate change, full employment rhetoric risks playing into the hands of the reactionary forces who insist we must continue burning fossil fuels, whatever the cost. Full employment was not always the main credo of the left. In the early 19th century, the drudgery and toil, the clocks and whistles of tightly regulated factory work were resisted by the artisans and farmers who were herded into the spreading factory system. The early movements for reduced hours, the campaigns first for the 10-hour day, then for the 8-hour day, reflected that resistance. So did the aborted American labor protest against wage slavery that followed the passage of the 13th Amendment. The idea that human freedom meant liberation from work was also at the core of Marx's critique of wage labor and inspired many critical intellectuals. John Maynard Keynes speculated in 1930 that Western nations were on the verge of a general prosperity sufficient to enable the masses of the population to limit their work time to perhaps 3 hours a day, so they could devote the remainder of their time to the enjoyment of art, love, the quest for knowledge, and so on. But nothing like this happened. Although market societies did become steadily richer, there was no further reductions in average working hours after the 8-hour workday had become the norm, except in a few affluent European countries. Instead, the demands of work have become ever more insistent, even as many of us accumulate far more things than we actually need or that the planet can sustainably provide. Sorry about that. So, what then should be done? We think it is high time to liberate elect policy catechism from its obsession with full employment and the corollary fear of creating dependency through government income support. We need to attack problems of poverty directly rather than wait for some glorious future day when full employment will finally arrive. This means that we have to give money and other forms of assistance to the people who need it. We need to return to the idea that was last seriously considered in the late 60s of creating a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens. This idea has gained increasing support in recent years, including from prominent economists such as Robert Wright, Joseph Stiglitz, and Anthony Atkinson. This approach would simultaneously make a huge dent in poverty, tighten the labor market, and begin to redress the obscene inequality in the distribution of income. Given the recent hegemony of austerity and government cutbacks, talk of income guarantees may seem like pie in the sky. So too does full employment. Still, if we look beyond the family of Western welfare states, there are actually few models that we might begin to emulate. New models that we might begin to emulate. In direct contradiction to our expectation that the West must lead the way, middle-income countries across the globe have been pioneering cash assistance programs that do not require a record of steady employment by the recipient, as social insurance does. Neither are they conditional on work or make-work regimens, as TANF is. In Latin America, East Asia, and Africa, governments have introduced cash transfer programs that reach huge swaths of the population and are not contorted by the dictums of less eligibility. These make a significant dent in income inequality. In Brazil, the Bolsa Familia program, which began as an effort to reward poor families for keeping their children in school, now covers 1/4 of the population and provides 51% of their income. In Mexico, Prospera program covers 23.2 million people and contributes 45% of their income. Across the globe, 118 countries have instituted broad cash transfer programs. Although the programs are relatively new, they have already had a demonstrable impact on poverty and inequality. A 2012 UN report showed that poverty rates in Latin America had dropped to their lowest level in 2 decades, from 48.4% to 31.4%, while the rate of extreme poverty fell from 22.6% to 12.3%. Moreover, the boost in public spending was accompanied by an increase in wage income. If anything, these programs seem to prove that giving the poor money does not make them lazy and dependent. On the contrary, protecting them from hunger and homelessness helps them to be more productive. It is just possible that these efforts could be the first steps towards institutionalizing a global basic income established through international cooperation as a strategy to fight poverty and the devastating consequences of climate change. We have even seen some small signs of parallel developments in the United States. The Obama administration has pushed an initiative to eliminate homelessness among veterans by providing them with housing first, which represents a sharp break with earlier policies that insisted on behavior changes before assistance. Cities including Phoenix, Houston, New Orleans, and Salt Lake City have announced success in providing a home for every veteran living on the street. Moreover, the strategy has been cost-effective and has been proven better than previous strategies in helping this population deal with the psychiatric and addiction issues that often precede homelessness. To be sure, the successes of this program come from combining resources from the Veterans Administration with public and private funds raised at the local level. But the point is that social problems can be solved by throwing money at them, contrary to the rhetoric of dependency. You can handle the problem of civilian homelessness in the same way. The obstacle is not dependency. It is a lack of political will to spend the money and build more public housing units. And no one should be allowed to claim that our refusal to spend money to assist those in poverty makes any economic sense. To think of the nearly 3 million children growing up in families in extreme poverty, living in $2 per person per day or less. Most of these families are homeless or transitory, moving from one tenuous living situation to another. Adequate nutrition for these children is uncertain, and their schooling is regularly disrupted by constant family crises. Household instability means that only a few small fraction of these children will end up graduating from high school, much less college. The irony, of course, is that a substantial percentage of these children will grow up being dependent because of mental problems, addiction, or incarceration. Just as with the homeless vests, it is much better social policy to spend money now on prevention than to deal with ever more costly issues for an entire lifetime. Our point is that the persistence and deepening of American poverty, the trends in labor markets, and the clear ecological dangers of unceasing economic growth all argue for an entirely different welfare state, one that is unshackled from labor market imperatives. This is unlikely to be accomplished all at once. But we can still keep the grim lessons of less eligibility in mind as we work to move toward a society in which all are ultimately afforded protection from economic hardship. An authentic feminist movement must keep that principle firmly in mind. That's it for that short leftist essay. That was a piece called, make sure I get the right name, Ending Poverty as We Know It by Francis Fox Piven and Fred Block. And again, this is from the book False Choices, The Faux Feminism of Hillary Rodham Clinton. Most of the writers in this book are socialist women, and they have a lot to say about Hillary Clinton. This was just one piece from this book as a preview. I think it's a very interesting read, and for any leftists out there, I think it's something that's definitely going to give you some things to think about. So, that is it for that. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I'd like to do a lot more leftist readings in the future. It's something that I really do enjoy, is reading and discussing these pieces. Feel free to leave comments. I don't have any problem with discussion, as long as it's healthy discussion. If you disagreed with what the article said, feel free to do so, but keep it civil, keep it friendly. If it gets upsetting or ugly, then I will delete comments. But yeah, otherwise that's all I have to say. I thought it was a really interesting piece, and so that's why I read it to you today. And I'd like to do more of these in the future. So, this is Boozy ASMR. The Jack and Honey Dr. Pepper. Saying goodbye.